Hello, everybody, and welcome to the CSTA's webinar series. The title of this webinar presentation is Building a Winning Bid. I'm Steve Trainer on behalf of the Canadian Sport Tourism Alliance. I'll be overseeing technology, taking your questions, and supporting the presenter. Our speaker today is none other than Bob O'Doherty. Bob is an expert at major bid processes and the author of the CSTA's very popular sport event bid template. The webinar is scheduled to last 45 minutes to 1 hour. Bob will make his presentation, and there will be an opportunity throughout the presentation for questions and answers. There will also be a final opportunity for questions and answers at the end of the webinar. But before we get started, let's go through a few technology items. If you can notice, you see a dashboard at the top right of your screen. And for audio purposes, can we make sure everyone is using the audio feature properly? If you've dialed in on your home phone, and please ensure that you have entered the audio PIN number. Note that all attendees are muted due to the number of people on the line and to reduce distractions for all. So if you try to speak up right now and get my attention, no one will be able to hear you. If you are using the microphone and speakers on your computer as your audio and you experience any trouble with audio during the webinar, it can most likely be resolved by switching to the telephone audio option. So before we go any further, please raise your hand, press the raise your hand button to show me that your audio is working properly. Let's take a look at our attendees here. Okay, see lots of hands going up. That's great. Okay, so and questions. We really encourage questions. We've got an expert speaker here, a subject matter expert. So I want you to please type your questions in the box near the bottom of your dashboard, and I will let the presenter know when we have a question, when there is an appropriate time to pause. If you have technology-related questions or issues, please do bring these forward so that we can try and address them right away and ensure you get to fully experience the webinar. I just want to note there is a handout, a PDF version of the presentation is provided to you in your menu. You can see it under handouts. There will also be a video copy of the webinar shared only to participants today. So feel free to download the handout before you leave the webinar, and we will be circling back tomorrow with a copy of the video and the PDF as well. So let's get this started. Let's move over to Bob, who will kick things off for us. Bob?
Thanks very much, Stephen, and let me start off by saying how pleased I am to be here today. It seems to be very timely. I think everyone on the call probably knows by now that the Canada-Mexico-USA bid was successful in being selected to host the 2026 Men's World Cup. That's fantastic news for Canada, and I'm sure there'll be lots of discussion in the coming days and weeks as to how Canada can maximize that opportunity. Personally, I've also just come through a fantastic experience, which I'll probably share throughout the presentation, where I was the lead for the Ottawa bid, which was successful in hosting a Volleyball Nations League event this past weekend in Ottawa. And it's a great story about from a few angles, but at the end of the day, we also delivered a fantastic event, which has led to us being awarded the right to host the same event in 2019 and potentially in 2020 right back here in Ottawa. So I'm going to give some examples from that story. So it's a great day for sport in Canada for all of us, and it was certainly a great weekend for us here in Ottawa hosting a world-class competition, which was called by the International Federation the best event that they've seen hosted this year anywhere in the world. So feeling pretty good right now. Myself, I've been involved in sport for 30 years, from 1986 to 2016 when I officially retired. I say officially retired because I'm back doing some of the same things I used to do. But my last 20 years are really focused from about the mid-90s to 2016 on bidding for and hosting major sporting events here in the Ottawa area. And a lot of the lessons that I've learned over the course of that length of time can be shared throughout everyone on the call today. I'm supposed to be retired. I came back, my last gig was working for the Toronto 2015 Pan Am Para-Pan Am Sports Organizing Committee. Came back from Toronto in 2016. I'm supposed to be retired, but here I'm back doing exactly what I used to do. And you'll see on one of the slides that I present that I have been active back in the realm of bidding for events to bring here to Ottawa, and I'll tell you why and also what the future holds. If I look at the slide that's on your screen right now, just to talk a few points on the agenda, which I'll be addressing today, I'm going to talk a little bit about sport tourism events, really focusing on those type of events that tend to lend themselves to a bidding process, because that's the focal point of our discussions today. I'm going to talk about the rights holder. Many of the people represent organizations that are rights holder on the call today, and I have a little introduction with some key points that I want to discuss. Going to go into a little bit more detail about the bid process itself, of which I've been through many. What I consider the critical success factors in building a winning bid. I'm going to get into some granular detail on what my opinions are in that respect. And the benefits of hosting. Why are you bidding? This is an important consideration. The why question has become one of the prevalent questions that has to be answered when submitting a bid. I'm also going to be discussing a targeted approach, why bid organizations must define what is an acceptable success rate for your organization with regards to the types of bids that you're submitting and what the success rate in those bids are. And then finally, one of the useful tools that CSTA has in this area is the sport event bid template, and I'm going to look at this good resource tool at a high level and give you an introduction to it, and let yourselves do a much deeper dive because we're restricted by time. I would encourage you throughout my presentation today, as Steve has already indicated, to submit questions throughout the presentation, and certainly I will address them as Steve identifies those questions and allows me the opportunity to do so. So let's kick this off, the agenda, by getting right into sport tourism events. I've broken up sport tourism events into 5 key categories. The ones in red are the ones that really lend themselves to bid processes. The last 2 really don't. I'm going to work myself from the bottom up. So when I talk about inter-community events, those are events that communities have established on an ongoing basis. A good example would be sister city competitions. For those of you that are not familiar, Hamilton in Ontario and Flint, Michigan in the States are sister cities, and they've been holding a Can USA Games now for 60 years. It has grown from humbling beginnings to 1,400 athletes with 16 sports. So these inter-community events, given the example I've just talked about, are throughout Canada. These are ongoing events. They do not require bids, but they are considered major sport tourism events, which obviously give a lot of the same benefits. In addition to that, an important aspect of sport tourism organizations now are manufactured or created events. Here locally, for example, in Ottawa, we have the Bell Capital Cup, which is entering its 20th year. It was a manufactured event back in 1998, where we have hockey teams from all over the world, from the age groups 9 to 13 and Adam and Pee Wee. The event has now over 500 plus teams internationally during the last week of December, after the Christmas holiday on the 25th, 26th. And that event was put into place to fill hotel rooms and fill venues that weren't being used during that time period. And so there are many communities across Canada that have identified those opportunities to manufacture or create their own events, again, which have the same legacy benefits. In an event like Bell Capital Cup that is sustainable, now in its 20th year, are great additions to any sport tourism market across Canada. More interestingly enough, in my background, are the top 3, which all lend themselves to bidding processes before an event is actually awarded. Professional amateur sport leagues and events in Canada, we're all familiar with NHL, NBA, and Major League Baseball, for example. Those cities in Canada that have those type of entities have opportunities to bid for and host all-star games and drafts. Here in Ottawa, we've done both. At the amateur level, from a hockey perspective, we have the Canadian Hockey League, which has the Memorial Cup, and they also have all-star games and international games, which are put out for bid. Those are opportunities for communities across Canada to host significant world-class events. Single sport events are really driven by PSOs, NSOs, and international federations. Lots of great examples, which I'll give subsequently, but we have a lot of callers, a lot of people that are on the call today that represent those organizations. They also include organizations that are, I would consider multi-sport organizations that have single sports, like, for example, University Sport here in Canada and the FISHU organization internationally have single sport opportunities to host at the national and international level. Similarly, in Canada, we have multi-sport and major games opportunities. We have provincial games, we have Canada games, and certainly from a bigger perspective in Canada, we've had opportunity to host Commonwealth, Pan Am, and Olympic Games. Most recently, Toronto 2015 for Pan Am, 2010 for Olympic Games in Vancouver, and 94 for Commonwealth in Victoria. And those opportunities come around on a cyclical basis. So lots of great product out there, but again, the top three are the product lines that we're really going to focus on when we talk about bidding procedures. Probably the most important partner and stakeholder in any bidding process is the rights holder themselves. And these are the governing bodies that hold the rights to a number of sport events and related activities in their specific sport or multi-sport environment. So typically in our neck of the woods, that's provincial sport organizations, national sport organizations, multi-sport organizations, and international federations. So if I give the example of a singular sport, and I'll use the sport of volleyball because it's fresh in my mind coming off the Volleyball Nations League event here in Ottawa, we have the Ontario Volleyball Association, which controls the events across Ontario, including provincial championships. We have Volleyball Canada, which controls the national championships in each age category. We have the International Federation, the FIVB, which controls all their international events, Volleyball Nations League being one of them. We also have U Sports. So University Sports controls university volleyball, which has championships at provincial and national levels. And they would partner with the OUAA in Ontario. And also we have the Canadian Colleges Athletic Association, which would do so at the college level in individual sports. We also have high school representation, where in Ontario we have OFSAW, and all the other provinces we have similar representative organizations. So I think what I'm trying to say is there's a lot of product out there when you include all these rights holders and the number of individual sports and multi-sport opportunities that we have across Canada to host major events either provincially, nationally, or internationally. So for someone like me that's in the sport tourism world, or like yourselves on the call, it's a very exciting time to be involved in this enterprise of sport tourism. I'd also like to point out that I included the terminology like-minded organizations. So there's such things like World Police and Fire Games, Canadian or Can-Am Police and Fire Games. We have World Transplant Games, Canadian Transplant Games. We have the World Gay Games. These are all opportunities to host major sporting events that have significant legacy benefits to any successful host organization. We have a number of Canadian cities that are hosting events like this in future years and continue to bid for those events. They would fall into the same category of there's rights holders for each of these products, and we as bidding organizations have to be quite familiar with those rights holders if we want to be successful. Why? Well, the rights holder is responsible for overseeing the bid process. In the end, they have some type of process in place that awards it to a successful host community, and then they partner with the successful host community to deliver, hopefully, a best ever event. So the rights holder, again, I come back to my opening statement, for me, represents probably the most important partner and stakeholder in the bidding process. Now, the bid process itself is one that's very scalable depending upon the complexity and length that is required by the rights holder. Certainly, in my first statement, the complexity and length depends on the size and scope of the event. And the two examples that recent examples that I'd like to give is Ottawa was involved in bidding for the 2021 Canada Games, which was awarded to the province of Ontario. It was a year-long process. It involved two separate bid documents, one technical, one operational. It required two separate site visits and in-person presentations by the bid committee to the evaluation, two separate evaluation committees that had been established by the Canada Games. So that's an example of, I think everyone on the call is probably familiar with the complexity and size of the Canada Games. You can see on a relative basis what the scope of the event really determines the time and assets that are required by an interested bidding community. Similarly, on the opposite end of the spectrum is the Volleyball Nations League event, which I just came through. I actually got called to a breakfast date on August 21st of this past summer. So this is last August 21st. And I was asked to, by some key partners in the Ottawa area, to put together a bid for Ottawa to host the 2019 event. And lo and behold, I had 2 weeks to do it. So Canada Games in of itself was 12 months. Volleyball Nations League, which had some big operational requirements, was 2 weeks. So one of the things that I'll talk about later on is the go, no-go decision by a bid organizing committee. For example, do you have enough time and resource to allocate to ensure that you have a chance to be a winning bid? I really felt that we did, and we couldn't pass up the opportunity. So within that 2-week period, we submitted what I thought was a fairly substantially not only a provocative bid, but one that met all the technical requirements and provided an outstanding opportunity for Volleyball Canada and the rights holder, the International Federation, to grow their business. And we were successful in winning that bid, which we found out by the end of the end of September. And so we formed our organizing committee, of which I was also the chair, in October, with our first meetings later in October. So you can see those opportunities you have to be prepared for as well, where if you think the event is worthy from a legacy perspective of what you're going to deliver in your community, you have to ensure that you can be nimble enough to activate the resources that you need to be successful in the bid process. So there's an example of two opposite ends of the spectrum. Each deals with different sizes and scopes of events and complexities and length. But I think for a successful bid organization, and there's some communities on the call, you have to be nimble enough to make a good no-go decision when it comes to bids, and to ensure that you can still meet your success rate that you've established as an organization.
Bob, I have a first question here. It's from Kara. She wants to ask, what do you mean by a provocative bid?
I think what I meant there is that we in Ottawa brought to the table some things that other countries, that other bidders across Canada could not. So I don't want to reveal any trade secrets because I know it's a very competitive marketplace. But what we were able to do is to provide an opportunity for Volleyball Canada and the International Federation to do some things that they otherwise couldn't do in the other Canadian cities that had bid. And that gave us a competitive advantage. And some of them were new things that enhanced the event itself, which the FIVB wasn't necessarily looking for. And I think I say provocative in that it got them thinking that we're not only trying to deliver an event here, but we're trying to grow the sport of volleyball in our brand at the same time, just not the event in of itself. And I think that caused them to maybe look outside the box a little bit and see the added opportunity that they had with their event here in Ottawa as opposed to the other competitive bids that they had received. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yep. Thank you very much, Bob.
The other things that I note on this slide is that the bid process can include several components. I gave some examples of that with regards to submission of a bid document or multiple bid documents. The same with in-person presentations, and one or more site visits, obviously depending upon the size and scope of the event. The rights holder also has a responsibility to ensure in their bid guidelines that they provide comprehensive, detailed outline of what the bid process is, its timelines, the event itself, obviously the hosting standards, so what's required of an interested host community, what's required by the bid process itself as far as a bid document and how the selection process is going to be made, but should be open and transparent. So at the end of the day, all the host communities that are competing have an opportunity to sit down with the rights holder at the end of the bid process in an open and transparent way to evaluate what they did well and what they didn't do well. And certainly I see this more and more, the rights holders moving to this type of a process. I will say, however, that the biggest complaint that I hear from bid organizations about rights holders is the lack of detailed information that is provided in the guidelines. The timing of the bid process, meaning they don't allow adequate time for the bid process, to be run in a fair and equitable manner so that each bid organization can apply its resources and be competitive. And I think that these are important points for those caller or those people on the call today that are rights holders, is that when you're putting out the bid guidelines, to ensure that they are as complete and as detailed as possible, so the rights holders don't have to continually come back to the bid organizations don't continually have to come back to the rights holder asking question after question after question, because the rights holder becomes overrun by the number of bid organizations asking questions because they're at fault by not providing enough detailed information. And the timing one is an interesting one. I believe that Volleyball Canada, for example, did not provide sufficient time in the bid process with regards to the Volleyball Nations League, but their hands were tied by the International Federation, which was late getting out the detailed information that was required. And then that becomes a decision of each bid organization whether they have the resources to meet the timelines that are in place. But I think the rights holders have a responsibility to get out in front of the bid process and make sure that they establish timelines which are fair and equitable to all interested bid communities and allow everyone an equal opportunity to apply resources to effectively compete against everyone else that's interested in hosting the event. The other piece that I think is important is resource documentation. Each of the rights holders has a significant responsibility to ensure that there's adequate transfer of knowledge, key learnings, and best practices to all interested bid communities. This documentation should be shared in an open and transparent framework with all interested bid communities. I encourage all rights holders to continually build their library of this information, so that people that are in communities that are interested in bidding for the events have open access to this type of information. You cannot assume that the bid communities have this type of intellectual information which will allow them to put together better bids and in that essence allow you to have better events. The last point on the slide is in regards to bid committees and organizations. Depending upon the scope and complexity of the bid process, one of your key planning decisions is how you're going to organize the team that puts together the bid and the bid document itself. Some key questions about who is leading the process and who is included in the process are important. And I'll give you an example of an important trend that I see happening now in the marketplace, and that is for interested host communities and sport organizations to partner with non-traditional partners who can bring what I call a skin to the game. And I'll give the example of two examples. The first one will be the Volleyball Nations League event. As one of the partners that we brought to the table for our bid was Ottawa Sports and Entertainment Group, which is called OSEG here in Ottawa. They are the venue owner operator of TD Place Arena, which was to be our main competition venue. And when I mean skin in the game, that means they're bringing their resources to help us with our bid. In key areas where historically bid communities and sport organizations require help. In particular, those areas include marketing, sponsorship, ticketing, and venue operations. We brought on OSEG as a partner with Skin in the Game, meaning they were financially invested in the project, operationally committed by allocating staff in those key operational areas, along with Volleyball Canada and the lead partner, which was Region 6 Volleyball, which was the geographical volleyball organization that governs this area in Eastern Ontario. And by having those three key partners in place, all the key operational and business areas were well looked after with regards to the bid. And we were bringing a partner on board in OSEG that otherwise, if we didn't have, we would have holes in our bid and holes in our ability to deliver a world-class event. And I say this is an important trend because later on you'll see in the document that back in 2008 and 2010, we were trying to figure out here in Ottawa how we could get the CIS Men's Basketball Championships out of Halifax after 24 years. And the way we did it was we partnered with Capital Sports and Entertainment, who is the organization that effectively runs the Ottawa Senators and the Canadian Tire Centre, which is what it is known as, an NHL arena. Very similar to what we did with OSEG this past 6 months, we did with the Canadian Tire Centre and Capital Sports and Entertainment back in 2008, where we brought a partner to the table that was invested in the event and bringing help and assistance in those key areas of marketing, sponsorship, ticketing, and venue operations. And those 4 areas were critical to the CIS in building its brand and delivering a superior men's basketball championships. And by bringing that partner on, CIS ended up deciding for the next 3 years, from 2008 to 2010, to bring the men's basketball championship to Ottawa. And it was a very successful event here because of it. The Halifax group obviously were very upset with us because they were already preparing their 25th anniversary celebrations. But more to the point, we started bringing in back then a partner that could deliver in a lot of the key areas that helped us build stronger bids. And I think that has happened here in the Ottawa marketplace, and I've seen it happen elsewhere across Canada over the course of the last 5 to 10 years, where these traditional non-sport partners are now engaged and involved as equal partners, not only in bidding for the event, but in delivering the event and being financially and operationally responsible as an equal partner. And I hope that trend continues. Some of the critical success factors that I've seen over the course of the last 20, 25 years, I'm going to talk about now. And really my comments are based upon the sport tourism marketplace becoming much more competitive and sophisticated, particularly in the last 5 to 10 years. And not only is it becoming more crowded, but there's a lot more bid organizations, sport tourism organizations that now have the adequate resources to effectively compete and deliver quality events if they're successful. So my first point is my targeted and proactive approach. I really believe that bid organizations or sport tourism organizations need to map out a 5 to 10 year strategic plan so they don't get caught short of time when they're addressing particularly larger bids. And I've seen this, down in the U.S. marketplace. It's been quite common for a long period of time. We're starting to see it more and more in the Canadian marketplace. I know here in Ottawa, we're trying to push Tourism Ottawa and its partners to put into play a 5 to 10 year strategic plan. And you need to do that because you need allocation of resources. Your community can't host all things at one time. And your community has to strategically set out a plan that allows some flexibility in your ability to win or not win events, so that you don't get stuck in a situation of having too much or too few at any one particular time frame. And you also get ahead of those major bids that require years of planning even before an official bid process begins. So I'm a big proponent of a targeted and proactive approach. I think it's critical to the success of any bid organization or sport tourism organization to ensure the longevity of its operations. Good research and networking. I come back to these bid organizations and sport tourism organizations building a library of best practices and key learnings. I survived a long time with a basement full of bids, winning and losing bids in a number of sports at multiple levels, so that I could continually build my resource library as to what was working and what wasn't working and what trends were in the marketplace. And I think any good organization that's forward-looking has to do that. Certainly, rights holders can help you out for the specific events that they're associated with, but you should be doing this across the wide spectrum of events that are bid out, and that you continually have access to this good research that you're putting together, so that you're not constantly recreating the wheel and wasting resources in doing so. And I encourage you to network with the rights holders on an ongoing basis. You know, the CSTA is renowned for holding annual conferences and occasionally a secondary meeting throughout the year. But to be good networking, when I mean ongoing, that means ongoing daily, weekly, monthly with the rights holders and their representatives, so that you can build a lasting relationship with them. It shouldn't be a relationship that's predicated just upon the timing of events. It should be one that's a regular communication / meeting opportunity, so that you can build that strategic network with the key people and the key decision makers with the rights holders. Having a clear strategy and game plan is really important. You know, what is our winning edge over the competition? And certainly that first question that I got about being provocative is a good example of exactly the types of things that you can do in your bid documents and your bid submissions, which separate you from your competition. And I know here in Ottawa, we've developed a list of things that separate us from the competition. And then we apply those on a specific basis, whether it's provincial, national, or international bid, and very specific to the type of event that we're looking at. To be successful, I would encourage every bid organization or sport tourism organization to have that game plan in play. And the game plan should have a number of key aspects to it, which again can be applied specific to the event that you're bidding for. And you'll see when we start talking about the bid document, once you have a clear strategy and game plan in place, the bid document becomes a tool that you can use to continually hammer home that messaging. One of the things that I've seen recently, particularly in the last 5 to 10 years, is also the benefits of hosting from a legacy plan standpoint. Some of the key partners in putting a bid together, whether it's the right holder, government partners, sport partners, community partners, and even corporate partners, a lot of them are now asking the why question. Why do you want to host this event? And a big portion of that answer should be your legacy plan. And we just came through this Volleyball Nations League where we allocated 10% of our budget, of our operational budget, to legacy initiatives. And these are legacy initiatives, I think, were part of the provocative piece, you might say, where we ran on a parallel stream, I believe it was 8 or 9 separate projects, where we had targeted adding capacity to player development, coaching development, officiating development. We had a schools program. We got into physical literacy. We also got into growing the sport of volleyball by having some exposure to our national women's sitting volleyball team and our Invictus Games team, where we incorporated with our school program. So kids were involved in seeing volleyball and different aspects of it. And this legacy plan got the financial commitment from the organizing committee, which was substantive. But it also grew the sport, grew the brand, and enhanced what we were offering to the International Federation and to Volleyball Canada. And I think it's now become incumbent upon bids and organizing committees to ensure that their legacy plans are well thought out, very detailed, and specific to what they're trying to accomplish. Another critical success factor is the host community partnerships. I've mentioned some of them, governments, for example. We can't survive here in Canada without good government support at the national, provincial, and municipal levels. Similarly, we need strong support from the most senior sport organizations in your respective communities, regardless of whether it's an individual sport or multi-sport event that you're going after. Community partners are important, including those non-sport partners that represent, for example, the arts and culture community, and from the corporate sector as well. All of those host community partnerships have to be detailed, and to be successful, the expectation from the rights holder is that they will be detailed in your bid document, because they don't want any surprises when it comes to partners if they award the bid to you. I've already talked a little bit about the strong relationship with the rights holder. I'll talk a little bit about that in a couple of slides again. Organizations that are interested in bidding have to have adequate and effective bid resources. The four that I always look at are time. You need adequate time to put a good bid together. You need people, not only strategic leaders in your community, but doers to put a good bid together. Make sure you have those people on board. You need financial support. You can only do so much with volunteers and seconded staff. Often you need financial support. So where are you going to get the finances to pay for that support to get done what you needed done within your bid scenario? And you need operational support, particularly on the IT side of things, which is being used more and more in putting bids together. The next check mark is a risk management toolbox, and these comments that I'm making are really situated upon those more complex bids that have to be put together with bid organizations or bid committees. And the toolbox that I'm going to talk about has to do with 10 different things. Specifically, organizational structure. Certainly, there has to be a formal organizational structure put into place for your bid organization. You have to identify who reports to who, and ensure that all the roles and responsibilities are spelled out. And that includes all operational issues. So, for example, who does what? You really need clarity on those two issues. Who reports to who and who does what for any bid organization that you have put together. Financial management. Anytime I get into a situation where I require a larger bid organization, I always bring someone on that has financial oversight of the project with regards to budgets and spending. And there's a lot of good financial people in your respective communities that can step into that role and do that. Similarly, the same with legal compliance. Often bid organizations have to enter into contractual obligations, and these contractual obligations require oversight. Make sure that you have good legal representation that sits on your committees to ensure that there's no problems in this area. Insurance coverage. You might have a bid committee that has staff and volunteers involved. Make sure all liability exposures are dealt with. Certainly, both your legal and financial people can help out in this regard to make sure that there are no liability issues if something happens. It's also a good idea to have some type of ADR or alternate dispute resolution process in play in case there is any disputes amongst some of the partners that might be involved in your bid organization. Number 7, I call it politics, ethics, and morality. It's very important that any bid organization or committee establish guidelines for behavior, and that is well communicated to everyone that's involved in the bid process. You certainly, in today's environment, don't want anybody that's operating with outside of the guidelines that have been established to ensure the bid committee is meeting the objectives that have been set. From a communications standpoint, 2 things have to be established. One is the appropriate network of who's allowed to speak to who. So having a good communications person leading those responsibilities on your bid team is very important. And certainly one of the things they have to put into play is any crisis management response. Things pop up during bid processes that have to be dealt with. And certainly having a leadership person to develop a plan to deal with crisis management and responses is very important for any bid team. Number 10 is critical path. There's only so much time that is given to any bid organization, sport tourism organization, put a bid together. And someone's got to be monitoring the critical path and working backwards from when the key date is to when key deliverables along the way have to be delivered. And it's important that one or a couple of people are responsible for monitoring the critical path and ensuring that things are progressing on time. And if not, corrective measures are taken immediately, because the one thing that won't change is the deadline date for the bid. And the clock is ticking. Two last ones. One is positive, transition planning. So the bid team has to put into play a plan, because it's critical to hit the ground running if you are successful in winning the bid. So a well thought out transition plan is a critical piece for any bid submission to show to the rights holder that you've thought about moving quickly to implement the team and the resources that you need to hit the ground running. And certainly it's a key part of any bid submission. On the other hand, if you lose the bid, you should have a clear exit strategy. So the bid team has to have something together that's very positive, which collects the key learnings and practices that have been experienced during the process, and also clearly identifies what the next steps are for the community, how to learn these implement these key learnings and best practices for the next effort. So don't forget about your exit strategy, because you're not going to win every bid that you're involved with. Next up are the benefits of hosting. Again, this is a critical area. It's a big one for me. I'm very passionate, especially coming off the experience of Toronto 2015, about the benefits of hosting. And all these should be dealt with any quality bid submission, or if you're the rights holder, you should be requesting this type of information as part of your bid process. So I've broken down the legacies into half a dozen different points here. First one being the legacies established from an economic, social, and sport perspective. Clearly, from an economic perspective, STEAM, the Sport Tourism Economic Assessment Model, which probably everyone is familiar with, it's an industry-accepted tool in measuring the economic impact of an event, and acts really as a report card for all the key partners and stakeholders that are involved in the project. So I consider STEAM a prerequisite not only for measuring pre-event based upon your projected numbers, but also post-event for ensuring that you've met what your projections are and hopefully exceeded them. And that in turn becomes a report card for all your partners and stakeholders. And you'll find that they'll use this data to go out in the marketplace and substantiate why this was an investment for them and what the returns on investment were. And it's usually taxpayers' dollars that they're talking about. So that type of messaging from those partners, particularly government partners, are critical for the future success of sport tourism in our country and the events specifically. Some of the social legacies, when I talk about social legacies, I'm really talking about creating opportunities for the community at large. I've already mentioned, for example, a school program that we implemented for Volleyball Nations League. We also had opportunities for disadvantaged segments of the population here in Ottawa to get involved as a volunteer, and where we distributed tickets on a complimentary basis to get them to come out and to see some of the competition, but also get involved in our school program, which had a lot of physical literacy initiatives associated with it. I think we now have a responsibility, if we're going to host major events, that we provide as many opportunities as possible with some of the active social partners in your community to ensure that you're delivering some type of legacy in that regard. From a sport perspective, obviously, I think there's clarity there. The opportunity for infrastructure legacy is more predicated upon the larger sporting events. I was fortunate to be at the end of the spectrum where we had a $750 million capital budget in Toronto, and the infrastructure legacy that we left will be felt for decades to come. Certainly, there's always a sport equipment legacy, which can be quite significant depending upon the size of your event, which can flow through back to the NSO, the PSO, or to targeted segments of the population, including local disadvantaged segments of the population. There's lots of opportunities for player, coach, and officials development. An example that I gave was the COC has a program, for example. It's called WELD, Women Executives in Leadership Positions, and we partner with the COC to provide an opportunity for those participants to come out and have an experiential opportunity to come and see our event both in the planning and delivery stages. So you can reach out with partners to even increase the type of legacy that you want to deliver outside of your own sport. And I think you should. I think you should be as comprehensive as possible in delivering as many legacies as you can on the sports side of things. From a hosting expertise point of view, every host community should be building an ongoing resume which captures key data like the size and scope of the events that they're hosting, the economic impacts that's generated through data, through STEAM, the profit and loss and budget sizes of these events, the number of volunteers that are required and delivered by the host organization, et cetera, et cetera. And the more detailed data that can be collected by host communities, the better off that your resume will be, because including that resume becomes a key part of your submission through the bid process. Volunteerism and leadership development is a big piece of the puzzle. Again, if it's just volunteers, from 100 volunteers to the 20,000 volunteers that we had in Toronto 2015, it's important that you create opportunities and build capacity for volunteerism in your community, and that includes leadership development, because these are the individuals that will continue to volunteer for you and develop leaders to assist in delivering future events. One of the key aspects of this area is who owns the database post-event, and it's critical that, in my eyes, that sport be ensured that they have ownership and access to any databases that are created through volunteer involvement, so that those people can continue to be communicated by the rights holder themselves and the sport organizations in the community that have hosted the event. Because it's one thing to collect the data, but it's another thing to continue to keep it current and continue to use it. And that requires the allocation of additional resources, but all organizations should be prepared to do that. I've talked about community partnerships. This is not only about sport, it's about arts and cultural partners, Indigenous partners, government partners, corporate partners, venue owner partners. I gave the example of OSEG with the Volleyball Nations League. There's a long list of partners that hosting sport gives an opportunity, not only for the host community, but for the sport or sports involved to build those partnerships. It should not be a one-off partnership. All the partnerships that are built in a bid document hopefully translate to your ability to deliver a world-class event, and then to sustain those relationships, to come back and do it again and again and again, not only specific to that event, but to other events across the spectrum of sports that your community is involved in. Community profile and visibility are respective of the media opportunities. Again, from the scope, it's really determined whether you have provincial, national, or international exposure. But there's great opportunities to build community profile and visibility at each of these levels. And something as simple as, I use the example of Volleyball Nations League, or you see it in tennis, you see it elsewhere, is the name of the host city on the field of play. So our international broadcast community that watched our games this weekend from Ottawa, Ottawa was placed twice on the volleyball court, rating camera, primary camera range, and it was visible throughout the entire match. A typical match is 2 hours, sometimes 2.5 hours in volleyball, 2 matches a day. That's 5 hours of free advertising to an international broadcast over 3 days. And that's the type of exposure you can't pay for, but it's the type of exposure that sport can give to its community. And again, that's scalable depending upon whether it's provincial, national, or international. And the last bullet I want to talk about is the community quality of life and spirit. I'm a big believer that sport is one of the key building blocks for a healthy and prosperous community. And hosting sport events is part of that package. I really believe it builds positive spirit, a yes we can attitude in your community. And usually what happens is the spectators say, what's coming next? I want to go see it. The volunteers say, what is next? I want to volunteer again. And it's that type of positivity that really gets you excited about the potential of hosting sport events in your community. So don't forget about the legacy that that brings as well. A targeted approach. One of my original statements was, to be successful, you need a targeted and proactive approach. Here's the approach that I took here in the community of Ottawa. It was really focused from mid-90s to 2010, and then I took a sort of a 6-year respite when I was down with Toronto 2015, but I'll talk about that in a bit. And then when I came back to Ottawa in 2016, lo and behold, I'm doing the same thing from a volunteer perspective because of the passion I have for what bringing major sporting events to a community can do. If you read the charts, the black are events that are bids that we bid on and won and hosted. Blue is ones that we bid on and won and to host. And the red ones represent ones that we have not been successful in. So it really paints a picture of what Ottawa is good at. And certainly if every community did the same thing, they would have a report card of getting a better idea of what a target approach means. So in Ottawa's case, for the examples that I gave, there were 26 bids here, 11 international, 11 national, and 4 provincial. So Ottawa certainly can host provincial events, but we're really focused on national and international events because we really believe that we have some natural or what we described previously as provocative advantages to allow us to be successful in those milieus of bidding. Also, you'll see that there's 9 volleyball events, 7 hockey events, 7 multi-sport events, a couple of basketball and soccer events. So now you're starting to get a sense as to the strength that we have in our community from a resource point of view. I'm talking venues, people, and other resources like financial resources, ability to deliver national and world-class events, et cetera, et cetera. These bids, our win-loss record was 18-8 or 69%. So one of the goals that we'd always set out is to track about 2/3 success rate in our bids. So being targeted and proactive, only going after those bids that we think we have an excellent chance of winning, knowing we can't be 100%, we're satisfied with 2/3. Again, it costs a lot of money and resources, people and money, to be successful in bidding. So to be targeted and proactive, it allows you to have a success rate that you can live with and show that your partners, that those events that you're successful in bringing deliver an ROI that's very, very attractive. Some of the ones that I've highlighted that I just want to comment on, Canada Summer Games is a very difficult one because it's got capital budgets associated with it. Any opportunity for a host community to bid for an event that has federal, provincial dollars or other dollars associated with it to match municipal investment are free dollars to help build your capital infrastructure. Canada Summer Games is one of those rare opportunities. I think that from a perspective here locally in Ottawa, it'll certainly be one of our bigger disappointments, losing in 2001 to London and then most recent to Niagara region. There's some questions whether Ottawa is a Canada Games market, but I think it left a bitter taste in our mouths. But I think there's some key learnings and best practices that we've picked up from that we can use elsewhere in being more successful in other projects, knowing that we won't get a chance until 2041 or 2043 when it comes back to Ontario to bid again. The World Junior Hockey Championship one is an interesting story in that you'll see that we lost 3 times. before we won the bid to host in 2009. And I think this is a critical teaching tool that if you believe in the event and its value to your community, you should have the patience and fortitude to continue building a relationship with the stakeholder. Never ever use the opportunity after losing a bid to go out and criticize the rights holder, criticize the bid process, or essentially criticize anything to do with the awarding of the bid. What essentially that does is it almost eliminates any future opportunity of you hosting. You have to take the loss and learn from it and build upon it and continue to build the relationship from it. All three of those losses we learned something from. Certainly they were bitter losses. Certainly they were emotionally draining in our community. But our 2009 bid represented all the key learnings and best practices from the three earlier bids that had lost. And 2009 became a slam dunk bid for us. And we continue to hold several records for the World Junior Hockey Championship because not only the quality of the bid, but our ability to deliver on everything that we promised to do. The CIS Men's Basketball Championship, again, I come back. We lost in Halifax, which took them 24 years, and then we won in 2010. That was the change in strategy, the point of inflection, where we started including venue owners as equal partners in bids, where they had actual skin in the game and were not simply service providers and making money off of you if you won the bid. And what I have found is it has made our bids much, much stronger, and it has broadened the viewpoint of venue owners to become partners in hosting multiple sports at their venues. And I think what we'll now see, particularly here in Ottawa, is a jumping or leaping off point of one of our key venues of TD Place and Lansdowne Park, bringing on a lot more events where they are equal partners or investors in the project as well. And the last one I want to point out is the only other one that really needs a better taste in my mouth was the 2014 Commonwealth Games bid. Some of you might have heard that it looks like Canada is going to have the opportunity to bid for 2030. And certainly, I know those of us in Ottawa are looking forward to the opportunity to have the chance to bid for that event because we believe Ottawa would be a phenomenal choice to host the 2030 Commonwealth Games. And so that's a quick snapshot of some of my experiences. The only other key teaching point from this slide that I want to indicate that I don't want to lose, and you'll see fourth from the top was the 2015 Pan Am and Para-Pan Am Games. We actually ran, in addition to the games, 48 test events. And what we did in those test events was we ensured that we created a partnership relationship between the rights holder, because many of those test events we had to partner with the National Sport Organization to submit a bid to the Pan American Sport Organization for the right to host the event, because we wanted to host an event at that level to prepare us for hosting the games the following year. Those new relationships that were created have opened up avenues for Toronto to host more events after the Pan Am Games were over. And I'm talking about the NSO partnership, the Pan Am Sport Organization partnership, and Toronto partnering. And so if anybody has the opportunity to host a multi-sport games event, don't forget that having test events in advance of the event itself allows you an additional opportunity to build key strategic relationships with the key partners and stakeholders involved in hosting events. So try and allocate some resources to have as much or as comprehensive a test event program as you can have to ensure you have more opportunities to host and more opportunities to continue to build those relationships. Okay, I'm going to take a deep breath here. Stephen, do you have any other questions to come through?
Absolutely, I do. Thank you so much, Bob. That was awesome. The first question is from John. He asks, how important is having a hotel tax to generate winning bids for the financial resources required?
How critical? I would say it's not critical, but it's certainly seen in a positive light. I'll give the example of Ottawa. Ottawa has just increased their tax to 4%, and everyone's required to participate. It's not an opt-out program. So Ottawa Tourism, for example, has seen a multi-million-dollar increase in their budget, most of which will be allocated to bringing in more events. So that allows them to allocate more dollars to support the bid process and to support those organizations that are coming forward to partner with them. So I say it's an important piece of the puzzle, but it's not a critical piece in the puzzle, in that most organizations depend somewhat on their local sport tourism organization. Here in Ottawa, we don't depend as much, so it's a nice to have, but not a live or die to have scenario.
So what's, as somebody that's dealt with major international events and domestic national events, for those people that are just sort of getting into that world, what would be your recommendation between them, or your suggestion with the major difference between international events and national ones in terms of rights holder relations and expectations?
Well, I think it's also predicated upon the sport that you're talking about. I've seen a huge difference between sports at the national level, and I've seen a huge difference between national and international. Interestingly enough, it seems that the more developed the sport is, the bigger the sport, the more resources that they have, it seems the gap is smaller. So, for example, the hockeys of the world hosting a World Junior or a World a World Junior would be, or a World Championship would be quite similar to hosting, a Memorial Cup. Sure, they're different in scope and size, but a lot of what's required through the bid documents and in delivering the event are very similar. Much smaller difference between the two. I would expect the same of sports like curling, soccer, those that are well developed both nationally and internationally. Where you see the larger differences are between the smaller to medium-sized sports that don't have the resources or haven't had the opportunity to develop their sport hosting portfolio very much. You'll see tremendous differences to what's required at the national and international levels. And I think it's just an issue of resources. So it's on a case-by-case basis.
All right. So another question: where do you see the growth of the sport tourism sector? We've obviously grown about $3 billion in the past 5 years. We're up to $6.5 billion. Where do you see growth in the sector? Is it in created events? Is it in more international events coming to Canada? Where do you see that increase coming?
Well, I'm going to be an optimist and say I see the increase across the board. However, there's so much product out there, and there continues to be a growth in product. I remember when I did a study back in the late 90s, I put together a list of every provincial, national, and international event that Canada could bid on. And it was in the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. And at the time, I was trying to create the argument that there was a tremendous amount of product out there. We just had to become focused as to how are we going to be successful with so much product out there. And I think we're getting, to this day, that product has grown. We're getting better, but I think we have to be even better for those top three categories that I talked about early in my presentation, where I was talking about single sport events, multi-sport events, major games, and even the professional amateur sport leagues. The product lines in those areas have continued to grow. I think that we have to do a better job of getting more of that product here in Canada. And that requires PSOs, NSOs, and governments to continually increase the amount of resources, particularly financially, that are available for interested bid communities to host events like that. I think it's a resource issue. The more resources that we have, dollars and people, the more we can bid, the more product that we can host. Because I'm a firm believer that the product line has increased, and that's where the growth potential is. I think it's much more difficult to see any type of significant growth in regards to community partners, to manufactured or created events or inter-community events. Those are like one-off opportunities, whereas the number of events out in the marketplace are in the 10s and 20s and 30s for each host community to increase their exposure.
Excellent. Well, with that, I'm going to wrap up. I want to thank everyone for their participation. I want to thank Bob for an excellent presentation. I know that the sport event bid template that Bob authored serves as sort of the industry standard. It's free and accessible to all CSTA members. And we know that Bob is sort of an industry standard in terms of being able to win these successful bids and providing advice. So thanks, Bob. You will be prompted, everyone, or some of you will be prompted to provide feedback at the end of the webinar. So please take the time to answer the questions about the webinar, as it helps us to improve the new webinar series. Finally, with regards to our schedule, our next webinar is going to take place in the fall. So we all hope everyone enjoys their summer. If you have any ideas about topics you would like to attend in the fall of 2018, or you'd like to pursue a sponsorship for the webinars, please feel free to contact me. And finally, thank you so much, Bob. I hope everybody has a great few summer months. Happy bidding, and I hope everyone executes their events with success this year. Thank you.